I had a friend who grew up in the 80s and 90s in their parents' puppet ministry. Was this an evangelical thing? I think it must have been. They had a ministry where they had these puppets and they went to different churches and explained the gospel and different biblical things and ideas with puppets. It seems kind of weird, but this is how they evangelized. I think it is pretty weird. Why do I mention this? Because it's a weird evangelical thing from the 80s and 90s? Yes. Because we're talking this week with Mike Aquilina, an early church expert, an expert on the patristics, how the early church lived and those first Christians worked and loved and practiced their faith and what that looked like. We're talking with Mike about how the early Christians, how the early church evangelized. How did they share the faith? And the answer might surprise you. And no, it's not with puppets. It's with friendship. It's with making friends with those around them and living radically different lives as Christians in these contexts. It's a fantastic interview. Mike is always so much fun to talk to. He has great stories, great context for these discussions, and it's pretty amazing how the lessons we can learn from the early church on evangelization in that very different time, in a pre-Christian time, really apply so well and are so closely linked to us these days in the 21st century in really a post-Christian time. It isn't all that different, and it's really, really fascinating. So here it is. Please make sure if you like this episode and these kinds of things, please do hit the bell so you get notified when new episodes come out every week. And please do subscribe to this channel and like these videos and please share them if you can. It helps to grow this channel that we're working hard to do. So thanks. Enjoy Mike Aquilina on how the early church evangelized. Hey friends, welcome back to the show. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. If you are listening to us on podcast, we're also available, I should remind you, on YouTube at youtube.com/thecordialcatholic. If you're watching us, thank you. Please hit the hit the bell button and subscribe so our channel keeps growing. And check us out on podcast as well, everywhere fine podcasts are found. I am joined this week by Mike Aquilina. Mike is a popular speaker, sought-after speaker. He is a songwriter. He is a podcaster. His podcast is fantastic. I had it here. I've lost it.
Way of the Fathers.
It's the way. I was going to say Faith of the Fathers, Mike, and I knew that wasn't right. The Way of the Fathers podcast, a fantastic podcast, I should say, and the author and editor of more than 60 books, including The Fathers of the Church, The Mass of the Early Christians, and for our purposes here today, out from Emmaus Road Publishing, Friendship and the Fathers, How the Early Church Evangelized. Mike, thanks for coming back on the show, and welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me back. You never learn.
I never learned. No, I should know by now. You know what? I do listen to your podcast every week, Mike. I do. So I'm remiss to forget the title of it. So thank you for that fantastic work. And I was doing a quick back of the napkin math here, Mike, just to figure this out. And I think I'm right. If I'm wrong, just correct me. But I have figured this out that for every book you've written, so every book you've written, if we gave every person on earth a unique copy of a different book that you have written, so a different title, actually every person on earth would get a different Mike Aquilina book. I think that's true. Is that right?
I don't think so.
I did the math really fast, but you've published a lot of books, sir, and we're in great debt to you. So maybe not quite that many, but a lot, and thank you. This latest book deals with how the early church evangelized, and this, of course, is a very popular topic for listeners to this podcast. So many, you know this, I'm sure you hear this all the time, Mike, so many converts to the Catholic faith come in by way of the early church. The early church fathers, they encounter them. I think of Rod Bennett encountering the church fathers in a Protestant bookstore and being blown away by how many different writings there were and how substantial that collection is, right? And so many people find Catholic Church through your writing that you've done and through finding these early Christians and recognizing in them the Catholic Church, and not often their own Protestant or evangelical church. This is my own experience too. I want to begin kind of by laying the groundwork here. You actually begin in this book, I think is fantastic, by talking about how the church grew in those first centuries, and kind of contrasting that a bit to how we're growing these days, and then you kind of bring about some lessons for us through the early church on how we can maybe do friendship and evangelization better. But let's begin at the beginning of you bring it here. How did the church grow in those early years? You talk about a couple of studies that maybe had some difference of opinions, but fundamentally, what drove some of the growth in the early church when it first began?
Well, first we have to recognize that the growth was astonishing. Rodney Stark, when he wrote his book, The Rise of Christianity, came to the conclusion that the church grew at a steady rate of 40% per decade for almost 300 years. 40% per decade. And that's all around the world. So we look at that and we say, wow, how did they do it? How can we do that today? And it's interesting, to ask the question, because at the time, Christians really had no access to media. Well, first of all, there were no media as we understand media today. There's no internet, there's no radio, there's no television, right? There's no printing press. So you can't even run off pamphlets, leaflets, to hand out to people. What was the medium that you had? Well, you can copy out books by hand. That was very expensive, and it wasn't going to get you very far because few people could read.
Yeah.
So what was the medium? Well, the medium was standing in the marketplace and shouting. And since Christianity was illegal, the practice of the faith was illegal, and it was a capital crime. If you did that, you might do it once, and you could be executed on the morrow. So you wouldn't have a lot of success bringing in a whole bunch of people. And if you brought in one person, well, then you just equalize that out by getting executed, right? So how did the church grow during that time? What was the medium, for evangelizing? And Stark and others have come to the same conclusion. It's friendship. It's friendship. It was the only thing the first Christians had to go on, that they got to know the people next door. They got to know the people who were in the lot behind them. They got to know the people who were in the market stall next to theirs when they were working every day. And they introduced them to their lives. And their lives were strikingly different, as we find in one early document. It's, that Christians really set themselves apart from others by the way they lived. And people saw what they had and saw the love that they lived, and they wanted a piece of that. Tertullian said that the early Christians, they wore charity as if it were a brand on their body, right? That's how slaves were identified, by the brand of their masters on their body, and Christians wore charity, he said, as if it were a brand. And that was our brand. We loved others. And that kind of love was a rarity then, it's a rarity now, and it made for a strong foundation for friendships. Friendships were the way the church evangelized, the way it moved forward through those early centuries. It was the only way open to Christians.
Yeah, it seems so, I don't know if goofy is the right word, but it seems so funny because you think of the strategies that some churches have these days. I think of, in the evangelical world, certainly, there are whole substantial groups of people who are paid on staff at churches to do evangelization, and there's all kinds of schemes they come up with and try and do certain different things to really bring the gospel out to the world. And of course, that's a really important thing to be doing. But this is so simple.
Yes.
Right?
Now, we want to see evangelization happen, but, we want to watch it from an armchair, it seems. So, we want to leave it to experts because we're so intimidated by it. We think that it relies on all these techniques and methods, and that, man, I'm going to need certification before I can do that. So let me do this video course, and at the end of it, I'll get my certificate, and then I'll be able to evangelize. So it's intimidating that way. Or, for some Catholics, it may be a turnoff because maybe they've encountered some methods that are used by fundamentalists and evangelicals, and they've been turned off by them. They feel as if they were being used, as if they were being made into a project, or being sold Jesus in a 90-second elevator pitch, or that kind of thing, and that just makes them feel a little queasy. So there are all kinds of wrong impressions we have about evangelization, that it needs to involve this esoteric knowledge or some kind of special certificate approved by the bishop or something like that. But really, it's what we're equipped to do from baptism. We're supposed to go out there and make disciples of all the nations.
Yeah, that's brilliant, right? It seems so, because there is that especially amongst Catholics, right? There is that sense of evangelization being a negative thing, maybe, right? This thing that is scary or hard to do, or something that, yeah, like you say, that you've seen maybe fundamentalists do on the subway or in the mall or on the street corner or something or on campuses. That's really a turnoff. But as you say, we looked at the example of the early church. We looked at them for so many things, and here's another great thing we can look to them for, right? Just living out that life in a friendship. That's right. That doesn't require any special skills to be a friend to people and live out your faith, right?
And they succeeded, and not in a way that a megachurch does. A megachurch, gets filled to the rafters for what's the lifespan nowadays? 9 years, and then the next wave comes into town and everybody leaves this mega church to go to that one. That's not the way the church grew back then. People were going into something that wasn't entertaining them, something that might get them killed, and they went in eagerly, and they went in for life, and the growth continued through centuries. So, I think we have a lot to learn from them. It's good for us to look back at them and really, I don't know, put it under a microscope, learn how they did it, and how they approach friendship in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about the early church, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions maybe out there about the early church until people actually begin to read about the early church. I know for me, and I mentioned this before, so many evangelicals, Protestants who live out their faith and think they're living in kind of an early church type model, right? We'd have these, sometimes small house churches, these small cells of Christians who get together, and we go, oh yeah, this is how the early Christians did it. And that, I think, is true in part. We miss a lot of what else they were doing or did back then. But I want to take a second to kind of talk about what that looked like, what the Christian church looked like in the early church. And we have episodes about this. You and I actually have episodes about this on this show. But I think it's worth kind of covering that ground a little bit here. And you break up the early church into kind of two sections, I think, in this book, right? This kind of pre-Constantine church and then this kind of post-Constantine church. Now, of course, some listeners might immediately have alarm bells going off and go, yeah, there's Constantine, right? He corrupted the church and made them all Catholic and brought the ritual in and this and that, which I think we can safely debunk. And maybe you want to say a word on that in a minute. But let's just talk for a second about how this early church, the context, how they looked, how they operated as it began to then evangelize. What was it? These little cells of Christians isolated from the rest of the world doing? Is there truth to that? What does that look like in the pre-Constantine kind of era?
Well, it seems that the church was underground for a lot of the time, and then it would be tolerated for a while. And then it would go underground again. There was persecution for the better part of 300 years. Okay, we do know that. The laws were on the books. The anti-Christian laws were on the books from Nero forward. So there was always a legal grounds for Christianity. Now, it was not always in the best interest of the emperors or the local government to prosecute those laws. All right, because sometimes you needed Christians to fight your wars, right? And to staff your army or to do other things that were necessary, and Christians were the best people you had at hand. So you relaxed the laws during those periods. But then, there would come another time when the laws would be back in full force. The 3rd century was a lot like this. It was up and down and up and down and up and down. Christians were always waiting for the other shoe to drop. So sometimes there would be periods of peace, and during those times, sometimes they'd even build churches for themselves and have places to worship that way. These Christian synagogues, some of which have survived from that period. So So how to describe it? It was a local phenomenon for most people, not because it had to be, but because communications was so slow. Okay, getting the word from one place to another took a long time. So within a city, you might have several house churches that were meeting, but they were always in touch with their bishop. And they had a pretty good system worked out for that. In that, in a lot of the cities, they would ordain 7 deacons because that was the model from the Acts of the Apostles. And the deacons were really the eyes and the hands and the feet of the bishop. So the deacons could kind of fan out in the city and get to know all the Christian people and get to know their needs, get to know the poorest and what kind of assistance they needed right now. And they would get the word out from the bishop, whatever word that the bishop wanted delivered to his people. So there were pretty good lines of communication within the local churches, and the churches followed the same model that they followed in 107 AD at the time Ignatius of Antioch was writing. They had the same structure that they had in 107 AD when Ignatius was writing. There was a bishop, and he had his presbyterate, his priests, and then he had his deacons, the diaconate. We still follow the same structure today. Rome enjoyed a primacy from those early times as well. But again, the communications weren't really smooth. They weren't really easy from place to place. So that was mostly a primacy of honor paid. Rome was a court of last resort for arguments and property disputes and that sort of thing. It's funny, we have one instance in the 3rd century of a persecuting emperor who called upon the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, in order to settle a property dispute in Syria, right? Because he couldn't settle it. He couldn't figure out what these people were after, so he asked the Pope to settle this property dispute. So you have a persecuting emperor who's recognizing the authority of the Pope over all the Christians in his empire. Amazing.
That's interesting. That's phenomenal. So things kind of shifted, right, post-Constantine, and I mean, I guess the myth, which we could spend a second here kind of going over, is that Constantine came and the first Christian emperor and legalized Christianity, and then the church completely shifted and became a political organ of Rome, of Constantine and his whatever he wanted to do with it, right?
Yeah, that's unfair to Constantine. It really is.
Okay.
Because he did legalize Christianity, and thanks be to God for that. I mean, the church had been praying for this for a couple hundred years. So God seemed to be answering their prayers in Constantine. But he didn't impose Christianity on anyone. He didn't make it the state religion. He made it his own religion, and he did give it a certain privilege. But what he really wanted was for everybody to get along. He's the first ruler in human history to talk about freedom of conscience, the freedom to worship as you wish. And he has several decrees from his long reign where he tries to enforce this. He tries to get people to respect one another, and he tries to allow genuine freedom of religious practice in the empire. Now, Constantine had these ideas. They were very clear in his head. I think he learned them from Lactantius, his tutor, when he was young. And Lactantius had really articulated these ideas of religious freedom and freedom of conscience in beautiful ways, developing on earlier fathers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian, but bringing these ideas to a new clarity. I think that's where Constantine got the ideas, and he definitely tried to live by those principles during his reign. His sons, not so much, right? and a lot of those ideas went out the window, and they were kind of heavy-handed in their imposition of Christianity. And by the time you get to Theodosius in 380, well, he's pretty much outlawing everything else. He's pretty much making sure that if you're not Christian, you understand you're a second-class citizen. So that's a long time after Constantine's death. It's half a century after Constantine's dead that these things begin to happen. I think Constantine gets a bad rap.
I think that's pretty fair to say too. I agree with you. So in this early church, you mentioned briefly, the idea wasn't to go out and market campaigns or go on the streets. Even during the times when things were relatively safe and stable for the early Christians, they weren't going out with banners or with marketing themselves in a way that we might see churches try and market themselves these days with a social media campaign or something, or making their churches very palatable for visitors or guests to come in, right? Kind of watering things down and making it very accessible and easy to access. They weren't watering down their faith, I don't think. They were striking up friendships, right?
Yes.
And you said that they lived differently in a way that you know they were Christian and making friends with those around them. And was it their lives and the way they lived that seemed attractive in general to those people that were then attracted to that? Was it the different way of living?
I think so. Tertullian's writing in 190 AD. He's writing in North Africa. He's a convert himself, and he's a very accomplished man. He's a jurist, and he's describing what he sees, and he says Christians are everywhere. They'd kind of become present in every business in town, in every kind of institution, every establishment, every profession in town. And he said that the only thing that had been left to the pagans, the only thing that had been left to the traditional Romans, is the temples. That's all you have left to yourself. But Christians were ubiquitous. They were all over the place, and they were showing themselves to be good workers, reliable workers. They were working for God. They were trying to be virtuous, and this generally makes for good employees. So people noticed. And as I said earlier, the other mark of the Christian was charity. Yeah. Charity. That he brings this out in his description of Christian worship, because he's talking about what the church does with whatever comes in the collection plate. Where do we spend it? He said, we don't spend it on drinking bouts. We don't spend it on parties. We don't spend it on feasting. What do we do with it? Well, we take care of those who are suffering in the mines. We take care of prisoners. We take care of slaves. We take care of those, orphans who've been abandoned. He goes through a long list of people who are in need, and the Christians are taking their community chest and they're spending it lavishly on all these people, and they're happy. It shouldn't be a secret, but it seems to be that we're happiest when we give ourselves away in love, when we give away the things we have, when we share what we have with others. I believe that those who were neighbors of these Christians looked at their happiness, saw their homes, and they said, I would love to have a happy home like that. How do I do it? And then they asked the questions. It was a dangerous thing for a Christian to share his life with another, right? Because if it comes the season of persecution and you're denounced as a Christian, well, then your life is on the line. So the Christians had to make themselves vulnerable when they were making friends, but they took that risk, and taking that risk, they managed to convert the empire.
And it's quite radical. That charity is quite radical, right? For the time. I mean, we take it for granted now, in a sense, that there are hospitals to take care of people, and there are there are charities that reach out to homeless people and to widows and to orphans, right, and to single mothers and these kinds of things. That's kind of taken for granted these days, but that was radical stuff, right? That was really the cutting edge of what we could call human rights, but charity. Right?
Yes. That the hospital did not exist before Christianity.
Yeah.
It's a Christian institution, and the same can be said of universally available education and a lot of other things that we think of as ordinary monuments of culture. These are the things that define us. These are the things that define our civilization. Well, they're Christian inventions. We don't appreciate that, but that's what they are. Christians were already laying the foundations of these things, and were already known for doing these good deeds in the 2nd century, the 3rd century, and up into the 4th century, when it all became legal. Now, at that point, Constantine did put the treasury of Rome behind so many of these great developments, so that within a few years, it became a very normal thing for a city to have several hospitals, and they were funded by the state at that point. But often they were staffed by monks and nuns, because they were the ones who were really giving their lives to it, and they were fearless in their treatment of the sick.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And two, you mentioned the risk of all this, right? That's so, I mean, in those times of persecution, I teach RCIA at our local parish, which is the class for listeners, the class for adult converts to the Catholic faith. And I always talk about the early church and some of the roots of RCIA. I learned this from you, from your books, probably actually. Some of the roots of these things in the early church and how it was kind of done in secret. And some of the titles we use for the people who are in the program as we go through the program, and some of the terms we use are terms that come from the early church, and it's this idea of being kind of surrounded in secrecy, and sometimes and being initiated into these secrets of becoming Catholic, and in part I think because it was a risky thing to become Christian at that time, right? And so these Christians, these Catholics who are putting themselves out there, who are living in the public square, who are befriending people who aren't Christian, who aren't Catholic, that is a dangerous thing to do, right? In a really real sense.
It's dangerous, and it's prudent to kind of give them a gradual introduction to Christianity, so that we didn't lead with the creed, for example. What is this Christianity? Well, let me begin by reciting the Nicene Creed to you. Well, the Nicene Creed wasn't there during the time of persecution, but there were other creeds. Okay. So no, that's not the way you begin. Also, they didn't reveal the sacraments until the people were ready to receive the sacraments. So that came much later in the development, and you can imagine why. Okay, you can imagine this coming from hard-won experience. Well, what is it that you Christians do? Well, we go to worship and we eat God.
Yeah.
Oh, you eat God, do you? Right? And who's your God? Well, he was this guy. He was a poor man who lived in the backwater, of the provinces, and he was crucified. That's how he died. He died as a criminal, and they say, "Oh, okay, got it." Right? No, I think that there's a gradual way you introduce people to the ideas of Christianity that are scandalous, right? When you think about it, the first Roman persecution of Christians was not for sedition. It wasn't even for arson, which is what Nero first tried to pin on the Christians. It was for a crime called hatred of humanity. Hatred of humanity. Now, what did that mean? What did that mean? And how could he make that case? Well, it's because humanity, the people Nero knew, were so identified with their sins that they consider them to be part of human nature. What is it with these Christians? They have a problem with adultery. They have a problem with fornication. They have a problem, with suicide and euthanasia and abortion and infanticide, because these were all, condemned in a blanket way by the early Christians. And the pagan world just could not understand these things. So there was probably a gradual way of introducing people to these ideas. And it's best if that takes place in the context of friendship, because you already have trust based on other things, right? We're coworkers, right? And I've come to trust you, in exchanges of money. Or we're next door neighbors, and I've come to trust my kids in your house, right? And that sort of thing. So we have a foundation of trust in our relationship, and we might be open, more open to these strange ideas of Christianity if we're receiving them within the context of friendship.
Well, it's funny because this is the same today in large measure, right? You can read all you want about the Catholic faith coming from a non-Christian point of view, or even from a Protestant point of view. But often it's those people that you meet that take you that bit further, right? Or say, hey, I should look in more deeply into that, or might trigger you in the first place to looking into that. Is that the person that you meet often isn't just reading a book in isolation or hearing an idea in isolation that really gets us going forward. It's that friendship, And I think then too, I want to talk at the end of the podcast about lessons to take away for us these days. But even right here, I can see an obvious one that we're not under threat of persecution as Catholics, at least not yet in large measure or a serious way. But we're afraid sometimes to share our faith with people when we have it pretty easy, Mike.
Yeah, we do. I mean, every now and then we get bullied on social media and that sort of thing, or we'll get shut down on social media. But we're not experiencing the kind of persecution you find, in early Christian history. We're kind of like in that period. There's a passage in the Epistle to the Hebrews where it says, you haven't yet been tested unto the shedding of blood, as if to say, stop your complaining. You haven't suffered the way a lot of other Christians have suffered and are suffering today. And we haven't. We've got to keep speaking the truth now, because the truth is getting rarer and rarer, and the falsehoods that are being spoken are getting bolder and bolder. And there are people who are just believing them in a zombie-like way. So if we don't say anything, if we don't speak, then this is going to continue, and things will get worse, and eventually, we'll see that kind of persecution that we don't want to see. We do tend to romanticize the early Christians because so many willingly died as martyrs, and they lived during these times of persecution. But we have to remember that when the fathers talked about this, they talked about this as a terrible thing, because so many committed apostasy as well. So many. Cyprian of Carthage has these anguished descriptions of Christians falling over each other, rushing up to offer sacrifice and to burn incense before the genius of the emperor. That should strike terror into our hearts.
Yeah.
We may not be as ready as we think we are.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think too, so many of those issues that come up, right? Those things that you're talking about, these falsehoods that are spreading further and getting more and more bold, right? I think of, it's one thing to call out something like, say, gender identity or sexuality, or these things that the Catholic Church has quite profound teachings on and is quite clear on. It's one thing to call that out on social media and just put it out there like this is what and get that backlash. But to actually befriend somebody and have those conversations in that context of friendship, right, is pretty powerful. I can think of some friends that I've had and have who were quite on a wide margin on how you think of these things, but having profound conversations and be able to say, hey, you know what? Like, you believe that, but here's what I believe, and here's where it's rooted in natural law and in the scriptures and in tradition. And I maybe haven't moved a mind or a heart in that conversation, but that person that I'm friends with walks away with much more knowledge of what the church teaches. And it isn't just yelled at them on social media or something. It's actually through the context of this friendship, right? That begins to move those needles, or at least introduce ideas that they can't just dismiss because now I've heard more of the whole story here, right? Right.
And when they think about these positions, they're not thinking about them in the abstract anymore. They're thinking of them as these positions that are ardently held by a good friend of mine. So your face is on them, all right? And it changes the way they think about these things. They're not just things that are done anonymously or remotely, or things that are done, in one of those red states, right? Ideas that are held out there somewhere. No, I know somebody who thinks these ways, and he's not a nut. Trust me, So it does bring the conversation, the big conversation, to another level.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I want to dig into some of these stories here because what you do is you bring the early church fathers here to us and some of their insights on friendship and these kinds of things. And I want to begin with Irenaeus if we can, because at the time of this podcast, which is in I don't want to date it too much, but mid-October of 2021, I think it is, end of October, we're looking at possibly a new doctor of the church. Pope Francis mentioned this. I know that you're very excited with this. I am a big fan of Irenaeus and was very excited also to hear this, and some mutual friends we have too. We're quite thrilled watching Facebook kind of light up when this was announced by Pope Francis. But here's a guy who has a lot of wisdom for Christians, a lot of insight for us into what the early church looked like, and some things that are going on there. What does he tell us about this idea of friendship? Like, what wisdom does he have to bear there for us?
Well, he's talking about how the friendship of Christ shows us that the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament, because Christ in the 15th chapter of St. John's Gospel, Christ says, I have called you friends, right? No longer servants. I have called you friends. So he's acknowledging that there was a period of servitude, and that's over, because I have befriended you. So this is something profound that's happened in history. Now, why is Irenaeus bringing it up in this way? Well, because he's combating the Gnostic heresy, which said that the God of the Old Testament was a different God from the God of the New Testament, and the God of the Old Testament was wicked, and the God of the New Testament was good, right? And so he kind of put them in opposition, and he's opposing this heresy. And he's showing that Jesus acknowledges this. Now, the kind of friendship that we see in Jesus is happening because of the incarnation. This shows us the extent to which God would go in order to be near us, to befriend us, to draw us near to him. This is so huge, because if you look at the way the pagans thought about friendship, the Aristotle and Cicero both wrote a lot about friendship, and both of them had the same idea that you had to have kind of an absolute equality in order for friendship to go forward. And Aristotle even uses as an example the what he calls the absurd idea of a friendship between a god and a man, right? That this is just something that could never be, because there's no equality there whatsoever. All right, they're so unequal that friendship would be impossible. But Cicero also said that you couldn't have friendship between people of different social classes or people of different wealth levels. That this just would not be possible. So Irenaeus is bringing up this passage of Jesus, who's God incarnate, declaring friendship with these 12. Okay, and even these 12, they weren't anything to brag about. Okay, they weren't aristocrats. They were ordinary laborers, and sometimes they weren't the brightest. They didn't get what he was trying to tell them. They don't come off looking really brilliant in the Gospels, and yet he's befriending them. And he's declaring that at the Last Supper. So what does that do for us? That kind of sets a standard of friendship that we're to live up to, okay? Because we're to live the imitation of Christ, to take the title from the famous medieval book, right? We're supposed to be imitating Jesus. We're supposed to be participating in his life. And if we're participating in his life, we're participating in that kind of friendship. We have to imitate him in his openness to friendship, even, with people who are unlike us and unequal to us.
Yeah, and I think of some of the parables that Jesus shared, right? Who's your neighbor? Well, here's a story, and he ends up being the person that we like the least, right? That we hate sometimes.
Yeah.
And I mean, that gosh, that's so hard. I think of a couple of things. I think of the amazing experience that I had walking into maybe my first or second time going to Mass, and one was that I actually at a campus university here, and I went into Mass, a weekday Mass, thinking no one was going to be there, and who knew what it was like, and I didn't have any clue, only to see such a diverse group of people. Just the ethnicities, the genders, well, there's two genders, but the people from all walks of life. There were professors there. There were moms with tons of kids in strollers. They were just, it was incredible, diverse in all sorts of ways I wouldn't have imagined. And you think these are the people that are here. This is the body of Christ that you are to so befriend in this context, right? These people are all your fellow Catholics, whether or not you would ever befriend them on a street or even have a chance to meet them.
Yeah.
And then I think also of then the parables, and those people that you would potentially like the least are your friends, right? And that's the model that Christ gives us for friendship sometimes, right?
Yes, 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 and it seems to have worked. When we talk about Irenaeus, we're talking about someone who lived in the 170s, and he did live during a time of fairly intense, though decentralized persecution. It was happening mostly through mobs and riots, local action, that kind of thing. But it was happening. Yeah, and yet the church was growing so fast that it was alarming the authorities, because these Christians come up with revolutionary ideas. One of the ideas that was most threatening at the time was that women should have vocational freedom. They should have the freedom to choose not to marry if they wished, right? Or they should have the freedom to say no to a marriage that they didn't agree to, and this was considered, you know, inimical to Roman family values, and it seems to have been one of the great motives for the persecutors. It's certainly one of the charges that comes up most frequently in the Acts of the Martyrs, the early martyrs. That women especially were denounced for refusing marriage proposals. They were denounced as Christians.
That's remarkable to think, right? That's what they were. Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
That's
But it
really
is
interesting.
upsetting the apple cart.
Yeah.
It's changing something that the Romans see as essential to their structure. It's a new world order.
Yeah, wow, that's really fascinating. So you dig into a number of early church fathers here and talk about their different ideas and some of their friendships together. Do you want me to pick, or do you have some favorites you want to go into?
I have favorites.
I'd love to hear your favorites. I mean, I'm sure they're all your favorites, but I'm sure you probably have some favorites in this.
Well,
collection.
my absolute favorite in this book is someone who's new to almost everyone who reads the book: Marcus Minucius Felix. Most people who pick up this book have never seen that name before, and he's often counted among the church fathers. And his writing, we have one of his writings, and it's called the Octavius. That's all we have, right? And it's usually in the collections of the Ante-Nicene fathers, the very early fathers of the church. He was writing around 190 to 200 AD, thereabouts. But most people have not heard of him. Why? Well, because he wasn't writing about churchy things, right? He wasn't writing about churchy things. What he did was he wrote a novelistic account of a holiday weekend he spent with two of his friends, two of his colleagues. Minucius Felix was a judge in Rome. He had come from North Africa. He was working in the city of Rome, and he had two friends who were also Africans working in Rome. They were also lawyers, right? And so they were close friends and close colleagues. And during one of the Roman holidays, they decided to go to a resort together for the long weekend, right? So they do that, and they go off to Ostia, which is one of my favorite places on earth. But they go off to Ostia, and the Octavius is just his memoir of that weekend, and it's beautiful because he describes things that you see at the seashore, kids who are skipping stones on the water and that kind of thing. All of these things he describes as they're walking along. But mostly what he describes is the conversation. Now, when these three friends leave for their vacation, two of them are Christian, one of them is a pagan. Very early in their time together, one of them makes a gesture of affection toward a pagan idol. One of the Christians speaks up and kind of witnesses to him that this is a dead idol you're showing affection to, and he says, well, you know what, that hurts when you say that to me. He said, I think that we should do what lawyers do, and we should have a debate, right? And so they have this measured discussion, right? And it's back and forth, and it's tough. I mean, they're saying hard things to one another because they're disagreeing about the most important things in life. So they're saying these things, but they're listening to each other, and they're speaking to each other's concerns. What's really interesting is that, they ask Marcus to be their judge, while the other two argue their respective cases. But by the end of the weekend, the one pagan, Cecil, is won over to the position of his Christian friends just by the force of their arguments, just by the strength of the conversations that they had through the weekend. And he declares that he's going to become a Christian. So I really believe that document in particular is extremely valuable to us because it shows us a process that we just get hints of in other texts. Just little hints, but here it's this novelistic description of a real memory of an episode from his life, and it's very beautifully told. It's an entertaining read, and I'm happy that I'm introducing the story of Minucius Felix to readers in my century. So many of them. It's funny because so many of the people who've read this book have told me that's my favorite chapter in the book.
That's phenomenal. And of course, the lesson there, Mike, is go on a Roman holiday with some friends, one who's not a Christian, and that's the formula, right? Roman holidays by the sea.
yes. Go to Ostia. Yeah. What's beautiful about Ostia is that you can still walk those roads that those men walked, and they're all still intact. Ostia was a city that was dredged out of the mud about in the last 50 years.
Wow. Oh, that's remarkable. Yeah. So we did actually set up a ministry that just sends people to Ostia with a non-Christian friend, and then lets nature take its course. That's a great model for a ministry.
What we need to do is follow the model of Minucius Felix and his friend Octavius in their ability to listen, to what people are actually saying, and separating the true from the false, and then responding to the misconceptions that are out there about Christianity, and doing it in a measured way, in a dispassionate way, because they manage that all through the book. What's interesting is that they never quote scripture. I don't think they ever mention the name of Jesus, but they're using what we would call natural theology to respond to these anti-Christian arguments. Where we hear the same arguments today, where people will say, how can you believe in a God who's all powerful and all good, and yet he allows suffering? They actually field that question there at the end of the 2nd century, and they field other questions that we're hearing from the new atheists today. But they really listen, and they really do respond in terms that the other person can understand and deal with.
Yeah, and they had that friendship first too, right? Which is so important, because that's where I think we sometimes miss. Again, this is the whole premise of this book you've brought to us, Mike. That we miss that notion that this is a friendship, a relationship that's going to, you can debate all you want on YouTube, and I can post all kinds of videos with apologetics and promote them, put them on Twitter and retweet them and all these things. But really, it's those friendships, those connections that are really going to, I think, most of the time make that difference, right? And in that context, you can have those discussions, and those should be cordial discussions, and like, this is a great example of that. But right, it's in that friendship context, which is so important, I think.
Yeah. So that is my favorite chapter of the book. I also like the episode of comes from almost 2 centuries later of the friendship of Basil and Gregory, Gregory of Nazianzus, because they were two of the greatest minds, the greatest Christian minds in all of history. And you think about it, they were college roommates. They knew each other since they were probably in their late teens, right? And they were both brilliant, and they were both devout, and they were both trying to find a Christian way of life. And they remained friends for as long as they were both alive together. Basil died first, and he died well before Gregory. But their friendship was not sugar-coated. Okay, they had very different personalities, and they often didn't understand each other, and they often did wrong by each other through their misunderstandings. Basil was one of these guys who was just a force of nature. He was a man of action. He was decisive, right? Gregory, was kind of slow to take action. He thought about things for a long time. His ideal life was really to be spent all by himself writing poetry. That's what he wanted to do. And yet, he was kind of passive too. And so he ended up being forcibly ordained to the priesthood by his father, and Basil supported Gregory's father in that. And then Gregory kind of pressured, or Basil pressured Gregory into becoming a bishop, into being ordained as a bishop. And Gregory just gave in. Now, Gregory had this pattern of just kind of passively giving in and then resenting it afterward. Okay. Just seething with resentment afterward and being kind of emo and passive aggressive, and so this is the pattern in their friendship. Okay. It was not this sugar-coated friendship. There's a lot we can learn from it because they managed to struggle through, they managed to endure in spite of these things. It's Gregory who leaves us the final record of Basil's life, where he comes to an appreciation of a lot of the things that Basil did to him, but also did for him, that he acknowledges that Basil was often right, and Gregory had not been willing to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and that's a great friendship. I really love the story of the two of them. It's phenomenal. And of course,
Yes.
those hot and cold, hot and cold moments, the on and off again, but then that remaining friends, and yeah, and seeing that to the end like that, and I think it's really remarkable and a good pattern for us.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
And I think the guy who's most associated with friendship, and because he thought most about it, wrote most about it, was Saint Augustine, who was such a warm figure. He made figures when he was a child. He made friends when he was a child, and he kept those friendships alive through his entire life. Some of these people followed him when he went to college, and followed him when he worked overseas, then followed him back to Africa, and followed him into the priesthood, and then lived with him in community, when he was a bishop. Augustine had the great capacity for making friends, and he made them all through his life. And so he thought about friendship, and he wrote a lot about it. His autobiography, The Confessions, is structured kind of along, these episodes in his friendships. When his friends led him to steal pears, when when he was young and his best friend died, and the grief that followed that episode. These are all the major events in his life. They usually involve his friends. He situates his conversion then among in conversations he was having with the friends who had followed him from North Africa to Milan. So all friendship is the context for everything that happens in Augustine's life. One of the last passages I have from him in this book is where he wonders. He's a very old man at this point, and he's wondering aloud, whether it's worth it to make friends, when you outlive them in old age, and you have to say goodbye to them one by one. It's so heartfelt. So in the course of my Augustine chapter, you really find this great mind and a very warm person and master of friendship, really considering friendship from so many different angles.
Yeah, and such an important figure in the church, right? So, of course, what he has to say on anything should be important for us to mind, but,
Yes.
but a wealth of knowledge on friendship, right? And so
Yes.
important. I wanted to then ask you, okay, so this book is in the context, written about the early church in our 21st century, almost the 22nd century, 21st century context. One of the things you highlight that really struck me as I read this is, that growth that the early church was experiencing, that 40%, we're not there anymore. And
No.
meanwhile, yet we live in the completely, where we are in the Western world and most of the world in a fairly free society in terms of freedom of religion and these kinds of things. But that's, in our comforts, we're not growing anymore. Quite the opposite in some cases,
Yeah.
right? So, what can we take away from the early church and how they did evangelization, how they did friendship, that we can carry forward in a much different time and place we find ourselves in today? Not anywhere like the kind of explosive growth and persecution, and it's very different. So what can we apply?
I think our times are defined almost by an epidemic of loneliness and
Right.
and a famine of friendship. I mean, there have been longitudinal studies that track friendships in the United States, and they're not pretty. It's that we see that the experience of friendship is declining. That there are a lot of people who just say they don't have a single confidant in their lives. They don't have anyone they can rely on, anyone they can open their hearts to. This is pretty tragic. In England, they've recognized that that there are, you know, pretty bad public health consequences from social isolation, from loneliness, and they've actually established a ministry of loneliness to try to deal with the problem. You know, we Christians should be convicted by this. We're supposed to be making these people feel wanted. You know, if we're doing our jobs as Christians, we're supposed to be in their lives. We're supposed to be friends to them, to the most difficult, right? Just as Mother Teresa was. And we're not. So many people are living such lonely lives today, and they're probably, you know, some of them are living those lives on our blocks, you know, not far from where we're sitting right now. So what are we doing to overcome that? I think that we have to start thinking in those terms. We have to start thinking about what we're doing to relieve the loneliness that's out there, because there are a whole lot of people waiting for another human voice in their lives. And people just aren't willing to share that way. We'd rather surf the web or get into arguments with people on the other side of the country, you know, and in the com boxes of Facebook or Twitter or whatever, you know, and instead of reaching out to the people who are close by us. I think in so many ways we find ourselves in a world that's a lot like the pre-Christian world, where we cannot count on Christian assumptions among the people around us, but we have to believe that there are people who can be converted, you know, the way those pagans were in the Greco-Roman world, and that the friendships that we make with them can be the context for their conversion. Really the medium that brings Christ to them. You know, that I think is the lesson from looking at these lives of the early Christians, to looking at the success they had, and then looking around us and wondering how we might do the same thing.
Yeah, and it's in those, I mean, I mentioned this before, but it's in those contexts where you had those conversations that somebody can go, oh yeah, I never thought of that before. Never thought of this thing that way. I kind of, even mentioned before, but kind of this zombie-ification of people's beliefs, right? We so many people just inherit these different ideas from the zeitgeist, from the world, from what they watch on Netflix, from media, right? And don't have somebody going, oh hey, you know, I'm your friend. We work together. Like, let's get you know, at the water cooler in the break room having a coffee, and this comes up, and oh well, here's a brand new, you know, context for this thing that I just assumed was everyone believed in was true. Here's the Catholic perspective, and suddenly, wow, I'm thinking this is really interesting, right? So I think you have those lonely people, and you have those people who haven't heard these ideas because they don't, right? They aren't out meeting Catholics, and we're not making the effort to meet them, I think.
Right.
And it doesn't take, like you said before, a degree to do this. It just takes, you know, being a friend.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's hard, and that's vulnerable sometimes, right? But I think that's definitely, that's our calling, right?
Yeah.
If we're gonna model the early church on, if we are going to, especially I think, say these converts like myself who are attracted to the early church in so many ways, and see in that these Catholic ideas you mentioned before about, you know, there was a bishop and there was the Eucharist, and these things that are very, very uniquely Catholic. We have to go the full way and begin to live, you know, in like you say, a way that is not so dissimilar as the early church was, in a context that, you know, that was pre-Christian, I guess. We're largely more and more post-Christian, right?
Yes.
These ideas are sometimes as novel as they were back then. Now again, right? They've become novel again because there's a decrease in those being the norm. These Christian ideals, right? Yeah.
There's a saint of the last century, Saint Jose Maria Escrivá. He had a great line. It was, out of 100 people, we should be interested in 100. Out of 100 people, we should be interested in 100. And you know, those 100 people, they're all interesting. You know, once we get to know them, you know, at first we might think I have nothing in common with this person, but if you spend a few hours, even spread out over a couple weeks, talking to someone, you'll usually find something that you have in common, something that can carry the conversation forward and carry a relationship forward.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, what underpins this is the Catholic life, right? The sacraments, right? The Eucharist, prayer. I mean, doing these things, we're not going out there on our own to make friends and evangelize. We're strengthened by those things we receive in the sacraments, right? And that,
Yeah.
that carries us forward in a really powerful way, right?
Yes. We're imitating Christ and we're participating in his life. We're simply doing what he did through his incarnation. We're going to places, that it may not be natural for us to go to into other people's lives, but that's what God himself did. And we're imitating him when we make friendships.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Mike, I always appreciate your time and conversations. You always have some great things to say, great stories to tell, and great perspective on the early church, which is so important and so attractive to so many people looking into the Catholic faith and looking into the roots of their own Christian faith and where that takes them. And this is a fantastic another book for your collection, your worldwide book tour. Eventually, I think one book per person, I think is your goal, which I think we can get there, Mike. I mean, you have time. We have lots of time left. I think that's a good,
who knows?
a good goal. Yeah. Where,
I am fascinated by that period of history, and I think we have a lot to learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're teaching us. So thank you. This book is Friendship and the Fathers, How the Early Church Evangelized. It's from Emmaus Road Publishing. I'll put a link in the show notes to find that. What else do you think listeners might be interested in this kind of vein, this topic? I know that I ask most guests where they can be found on Twitter or on a cool splashy webpage. You always say go to Wikipedia because that's your most recent, which is fantastic. So people can go there to find other links, your complete, I think, bibliography. But
Yeah.
what other books do you think listeners might be interested in checking out that you've written that might be in this a similar vein?
Well, I've written a lot about this period. The book a lot of people know is the Fathers of the Church. I've also written The Mass of the Early Christians, which is another one that's sold quite a few and is used as a textbook in some places. I've taken a few kind of unusual approaches to the period. I wrote a history of medicine that just focuses on how the early church fathers invented the hospital, and that's called The Healing Imperative. I also wrote a book called Villains of the Early Church, which looks at all the troublemakers in the early church and how the church kind of combated bad ideas and persecution in its own way. That book, paradoxically is one of my funnier books, actually.
And one of my favorites too. That's a fantastic book, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Listen, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks again for having me back.
Yeah, I want to say God bless you and the work you're doing for the church. It's fantastic, much appreciated. And I know there are just so many people who, when I said I'm having you back on the show, said, yeah, we love Mike, because so many people who listen to this show are converts, and really it's through work like yours that they can see the Catholic Church, they can see the footprints, the fingerprints of the faith that we love in those very first Christians and how they lived, and that points us, that points them to Rome, and then that begins the conversion experience. So thank you, Mike, and God bless you in that work that you're doing.
Oh, God bless you in your work.
Well, thank you. Take care.